right, welcome to Life in the Colonies. Last week we tried to set up the 13 English colonies, the colonial area the British had set up along the American eastern coast, stretching from what we now know as Georgia all the way to what we now know as Maine. Of course, the people there mainly came for two major reasons. One, to establish and escape religious persecution. And of course, those colonies certainly include Pennsylvania with the Quakers and Massachusetts with the Puritans and Maryland with the Catholics. And the second major reason the colonies were established was to increase wealth, to make money, to get rich. Colonies like New York and Virginia and the Carolinas and fishing off New Hampshire, all those colonies to get rich. And of course, then there's the odd colony out Georgia, which was started for two basic reasons. One, to send the poor people from English jails to Georgia, so they might have a better life and also might serve the king by helping increase his fortune, but also to serve as a buffer zone, almost like a fence to keep the Spanish and Spanish Florida out of the English colonies that were above Georgia. So those are the 13 English colonies. Now, as they would continue to grow in the 16 and 1700s, they did share some things in common. Even though they might have been established for different reasons, most of them had the same type of government. And that is, the king or queen had given them permission to operate. And the king generally chose a royal governor. Unless the colony was a proprietary colony, that meant that the owner owned the colony, like Pennsylvania was owned by William Penn at first, in which case the proprietor often acted as the governor and or with the input from the king chose a governor. But nevertheless, generally appointed by the crown, by the king. They were assisted by a council, a group generally of rich people that were appointed by the royal governor to help the royal governor sort of run the colony, to advise the colony, the governor on what to do, and also to serve as a court, almost like a Supreme Court for the colonies as well. Then you have the colonial assembly, that right to vote, at least if you're at least 21 years old and are a male, generally a male church member. In 1619 in Virginia, the House of Burgesses, and in, of course 1620 when the Puritans arrived, that spread to the basically the entire colonies because the colonies were in competition with each other, especially trying to attract colonists and try to sell land. And so what one colony offered, generally all the colonies offered as well. So the colonial assemblies were basically chosen by the local populace as long as they were meeting the requirements of voting. And usually, again, it was usually, but there were some exceptions. Usually as a white male, 21 years of age or older, sometimes owning a little property and sometimes belonging to the church, sometimes not. As we saw in the Fundamental Orders of Connecticut, within just a few years, the Puritans had sort of dropped that church membership requirement for voting. So that was essentially the structure of the colony. Now, interesting enough, the colonial assembly paid the royal governor's salary, which had an interesting effect because if you're the royal governor, you could be a rich royal governor or a poor royal governor, depending upon how well along you got with the colonial legislature. So if the colonial legislature felt the colony should be run in a certain way, and if you, the colonial governor, agreed and helped them do that, you could be a very rich colonial governor. If, on the other hand, as a colonial governor, you did not agree with the colonial assembly, you might find yourself a very poor royal governor. And that also presented some complications because oftentimes the royal governor was supposed to be enforcing the laws of England as sent over by the King of England. But if your colony didn't like those laws, well, the colonial governor could enforce those laws, but then he would be a very poor royal governor. Oftentimes, the royal governor simply turned a blind eye to what was going on in the colony and was a well-paid royal governor. So that helped loosen the bonds between the English citizens here in the Americas and the king and royalty and the British crown back home. So for number one, or one of the things that all of the 13 English colonies had was some type of self-government. We might also refer to that as a representative government. You might also refer to that as a democracy. You might also refer to that as a popular sovereignty. You might also refer to that as a republic. So interesting enough, self-government is a very nice English term. Democracy is a nice Greek term, demos krasi, the rule of the people. Popular sovereignty is a very nice Latin term, which also means the rule of the people. So even though there are a few minor differences between these definitions, at least in the dictionaries, in real life, basically all of this meant that people, the colonists were, at least some colonists, were voting for their elected representatives to make the laws for them. Another thing that all the colonies shared was the type of economic system they had, and that was free enterprise. Today, what we call capitalism. That is, you make what you want to make, and you charge what you want to charge for that product, and people buy what they want to buy. Certainly religious groups had come to America for religious freedom, but also if they had their choice of being rich religious or poor religious, most people chose to be rich religious. Regardless of your religion and regardless of how exactly you felt about the royal governor or even about the king, most people in America were off for better economic opportunities. And even though Britain sometimes had some laws that might try to restrict that free enterprise system, again, in the colonies 3,500 miles away by king from the ocean, the king oftentimes didn't know what was going on. He left that to the royal governors to inform him. And if your royal governor, again, wanted to get rich, he would, again, turn blind eyes to things that might restrict your freedom to get rich, your freedom of free enterprise, your freedom of capitalism. Again, people came over for different reasons, but in the long term, everyone was sort of on board with having greater economic opportunities. Of course, one of the ways to do that was to trade. That is, to take your product that you made here in America and perhaps send it someplace else in the world. Now, technically, again, all products made in the British colonies in America were first to go to England. And then in England, they would put a nice tax on it, and then they would sell it for you to the rest of the world. So the English would then give you some money for your product, but in selling it, they had jacked the price up and raised the price. And so oftentimes the English middlemen were making a lot more money than you were. For example, if you were growing tobacco and selling on the world market, you would technically have to send it to England, where basically the government would then raise the amount of money to sell it and then sell it to people in Europe. And most of the money would then go to the British government, and a little bit of money would go to you. Now again, that was technically the law, but oftentimes ships sail directly from America to other places to sell their tobacco and to sell their rice and to sell their indigo and to sell their products around the world. So a good balance of trade that is making money means you sell more exports, you sell more of your crop, you charge more for your crop than you bring in, than you're buying. So it's always better to make more money than you spend. So a good balance of trade means more exports than bringing in imports. One of the premier routes Americans had of trading was called the triangular trade because it represented a triangle in the mid-Atlantic Ocean. Obviously, there weren't arrows actually drawn in the water, but on maps there were, as on this one. And in New England, they made alcoholic beverages. It was cold up there, and so for the most part, it was hard to grow tobacco and indigo and rice, the big money-making crops of the South. And so the British citizens in Massachusetts usually grew something that they could turn into alcohol. And then they would take that rum and send it to Africa. In Africa, they would take the rum off the ship and then bring on board slaves, the same ship. And as they had just packed the cargo full of rum, the bottles and kegs of rum next to each other, that's basically how they packed the slaves. They then took the slaves and sailed across to the West Indies. Now, unfortunately, this is sometimes called the Middle Passage, and approximately about 20% of the passengers died along the way. Of course, this is still in an age where boats oftentimes only carry 100 or 200 people at the most, and especially when you're packing in people, that's going to lead to some problems, especially if one person has a disease. That disease spreads very quickly to everyone else, and oftentimes there's no way of stopping that on board the ship, which unfortunately led the crew sometimes to basically, they found someone sick, they simply tossed that person overboard in the middle Atlantic, saving, of course, everybody else's life at the expense of that one person's. So life was not good on the sailing ships. Of course, sailing ships of the day, regardless of whether you were a paying passenger, whether you were an indentured servant, or whether you're a slave, they certainly were not at today's standards. Obviously, if you were a rich person and could afford your own ship or your own area of the ship to stay in, that was much better than obviously being a slave and packed like sardines and oftentimes cuffed and tied together. But nevertheless, the slaves would then move to the West Indies, the Caribbean islands as we know them. There was a high demand for slaves. Sadly, the life expectancy of a slave coming in, or any worker coming in actually, was about 5 years because of a number of different conditions working there. The owners of that land would trade these American ships. They would basically offload the slaves, most of the slaves, and then they would give the American ships sugar in exchange. They grew sugar on these islands. And then Americans would take the sugar and the few slaves oftentimes back up to New England, stopping off on perhaps some of the southern colonies to export the slaves, sell the slaves, and then take the sugar back to New England where they made more rum out of it. And then you repeat the process, and every time you repeated it, basically you got a little bit richer. So the triangular trade, the Middle Passage especially, again, was very deadly for the slaves, about 20%. Of course, as a slave, probably, of course, you never had your choice. But if you had to make your choice, you probably would not want to stop off in the West Indies, where the death rate was very, very high and your life expectancy was very short. If you can make it to the North America, where only about 4% of the slaves actually ended up, your life expectancy was much, much longer. And believe it or not, working conditions were often much better, despite being a slave. So Americans were growing economically. They were also growing religiously and spiritually in what's called the Great Awakening. The Great Awakening was a series of religious revivals starting in the 1730s, only lasting about 10 or 15 years. They eventually managed to create about 350, 400 new churches, but also they sort of broke the back of established churches like the Church of England and the Church of England and the Puritans churches, and they led to new congregations, new denominations being established like the Baptist and Methodist. But also, this was a sort of a shared common experience. It's one of the few things that actually happened in almost all the colonies. Every colony was a bit different as far as why people had come and what group of people lived there. And so even though they shared a common language, more or less, and even though they shared the idea of free enterprise and capitalism, and even though they shared sort of the same form of governance, there weren't many social things that brought the people together. And so the Great Awakening was one of those social items that was sort of involved in all the colonies, which meant if you were in a New England colony and you went to a middle colony, you could mention the Great Awakening and they would also have some story to tell you about the Great Awakening. So the Great Awakening would also weaken the bonds between the people here in America and the king, because, of course, the king sort of ruled not just through his royal governors, but because the king was the head of the Church of England, technically, he ruled through the Church of England. But again, there were more denominations coming up, and people were experimenting with religion during this time, and so it sort of weakened the bonds of the king as well. Meanwhile, another thing that many colonies had in common was an education to give to their kids. Now, if you were in New England, you generally had a great education. The Puritans had left England and had originally gone to the Netherlands, but then they found their kids sort of being transformed into Dutch kids and decided to come to America, where they could make sure their kids were English kids, but they also wanted to make sure their kids had a great education. So in New England, they were really the first group to start public schools to pool your money. In fact, just a few years after landing, the Colonial Assembly there passed a law that said if your town basically had about 100 to 150 families, everybody would have to pool their money to hire a school teacher. And that school teacher would then come in and teach the students at somebody's home or maybe at the church while it's not being used. And if your village was a higher number of that, had more people, then the law required your village not only to put the money together to hire a school teacher, but your village had to actually put the money together to build a school. And traditionally, especially at the lower grades, both males and females attended the lower grades, and then there was a little break, and basically the guys went on to higher education, while the young ladies were basically left with perhaps a 6th grade education, 7th grade education, somewhere around there. Although, of course, that seems very discriminatory now. However, in most parts of the world, women didn't get any education at the time. So in the New England colonies, it was a much better situation than in many parts of the world. You could also, if you were rich, hire a private tutor. And as we'll see, there were colleges that were started in New England as well. If you're in the middle colonies, if you're in a big city like Philadelphia or New York, they pooled their money to start a public school where you could go and you can, as a child that was in one of those cities, get, again, a free education. Well, a free education to you, obviously the parents and other people in the town had paid for it. There were also private schools, there were church schools, and oftentimes church schools, even though they might be run by the Church of England, or even though they might be run by the Quakers, or even though they might be run by the Dutch Reform group, if they had empty seats, they would allow anyone in, regardless of their religion. Of course, private schools you had to pay for, so that was sort of the domain of sort of the rich people in those middle colonies. You could have private tutors, and as we'll see, they'll also have colleges. Then the southern colonies, a little bit different. People are so spread out, so far apart from each other, it's just not practical to have public schools. Simply put, people are so spread out on farms in the south that by the time you actually got to the public school, it'd probably be time to turn around and go home. So unless you happen to probably live on a large plantation where the owner would probably hire private tutors, you were probably out of luck as far as the southern colonies were concerned. Your parents would probably teach you what they knew, but if your parents had a 3rd grade education, that's what you'd be getting in the South, generally. If your parents had a 6th grade education, that's what you'd be getting in the South. However, in the plantations, generally, you had a really good education. The plantation owner had enough money to bring in some of the finest tutors in Europe. So your French teacher would probably be from France. Your Spanish teacher would probably be from Spain in that regard. And of course, they also had some colleges. Again, of course, a large portion of the South, again, spread out. A large portion of the South also engaged in indentured servants, which probably would not have an education, slaves, not having an education as well. So one way of getting education, if you didn't go to school, was an apprenticeship. An apprenticeship is a young person who works and learns a skill from a master craftsman. So, for example, if someone was running a newspaper and publishing with a printing press, they might need someone to work around the printing press and clean up, etc. And you as a young person, anywhere from 10, 11, 12, 13, would be allowed to come in, and you'd be allowed to clean up, etc. And you'd be able to watch how the master craftsman worked. After a year or two, the master craftsman would probably show you how the printing press ran and sort of showed you how to fix it if it broke. And within maybe 4, 5, 6 years, you might be able to be ready to go out and run your own printing press. So that was a great way to learn on the job if you could not afford a schooling or if there were no public schools in your area. Interesting enough, the colonies here in America were in some ways overeducated as far as England was concerned. In the 1300s and 1400s, England had started 2 universities, Oxford and Cambridge. And Oxford and Cambridge, for 1300s, 1400s, 1500s, 1600s, 1700s, into the 1800s, were the only 2 universities in England. And the king liked it that way because the king controlled who ran England, because he determined who got in those universities. So to go to Oxford or Cambridge, you had to be a Church of England member. You had to be on an approved list from the king. That is, if your parents or your grandparents, or even if your great-grandparents had revolted against the king at some time, you would not be going to Oxford and Cambridge in England. So sorry for you, you're just of the wrong family. So the king sort of maintained control of who came into the British government by controlling who went into the universities. But here in America it's a little bit different. Starting off in, as soon as the Puritans arrived, of course, they brought some of their church leaders who were very well trained from some different universities in Europe in theology and religion. But within a few years, those people started to die off. They died off because of disease. They died off because of Indian attacks. Some of them were just old when they came over, and the people of Massachusetts recognized they were going to have someone new to take their place as far as to train preachers and to sort of run the churches. And so in 1636, Massachusetts Bay Colony started what they called New College, a Puritan college, to basically train ministers. Now, a couple of years later, a rich guy in Boston died and left behind his entire 400-book library, which was a big deal back then, and 800 pounds, which again was a great deal of money at the time, to this new college. And so, because he was such a nice guy, the people of Massachusetts decided to name the college after him. Perhaps you've heard of it, Harvard University. Starts off in Massachusetts. Other colleges were soon not far behind. The College of William and Mary started off in Virginia just a few years later, run by the Church of England. Now, notice that many of these colleges are supported by some religious group, at least to start off with. So you can look down the list and see the different religious groups that start the different colleges that are still with us today. And of course, you can see their current name, which is, many of them are famous, like Yale and Princeton, Brown University and Dartmouth and University of Pennsylvania are pretty famous, especially along the East Coast in America, and basically started by religious institutions, generally concerning theology, generally concerning preaching, but then they soon spread out to other subjects. And this was interesting because the colleges started granting degrees even though they didn't have permission. In England, only the king could authorize a college. Only the king could authorize a university that could issue degrees. But in America, Americans just started their own universities, started issuing degrees, and never bothered to inform the king about these universities, never actually wrote the king and asked him to sponsor a university or to, to give them permission to give degrees. They just went ahead and did it, which again is sort of another break between the king and the colonists here in the New World. Meanwhile, the colonies continued to grow, especially economically. New England was known for its lumber. There were vast forests in New England when they arrived, and many of those trees have been growing for thousands and thousands of years, which is awesome as far as the British Navy was concerned, because at the time your Navy ships were made out of wood, and especially the taller the tree, the taller the mast. So if you wanted to go fast on a ship, your ship needed to have a big sail to catch a lot of wind. But to have a big sail, which was very heavy because it was canvas and cloth, you needed a big piece of wood. You needed a big, tall mast for your ship. Unfortunately, by the 1600s in Europe, most of the big forests had been cut down already for wood. And so the British Navy had been running short of these masts, and what they'd basically been doing was sort of sticking 2 or 3 or 4 trees together, but unfortunately they often broke during high winds. So these American trees were really sought after by the British government for their Navy ships. Of course, New England also known for its trading, especially the triangular trade, but some other things as well, and for shipbuilding. Obviously, if you're going to carry on a triangular trade, you're going to need some ships. And certainly you could buy them from England, but if you have the wood and the resources and the master craftsmen, why bother buying them? Why not just make them? It's cheaper that way, and you make more of a profit. The middle colonies were known as the breadbasket colonies. They produced a lot of food, especially wheat, which could be made into bread. And so the middle colonies quickly not only fed themselves, but they also started feeding the New England colonies and southern colonies within a very short period of time. And this was just the start of the agricultural revolution in America. When the British arrived in the 1700s, it took over 90% of the people to feed 100% of the people. Today in America, 1.5% of Americans are farmers. Not only do they feed 100% of Americans, they feed a large portion of the world as well. So that agricultural revolution sort of starts in the middle colonies, and moving to the southern colonies. Of course, you already know their big cash crops, their big money-making crops are rice, tobacco, and indigo. So even though New England was busily trading and the middle colonies were busy selling food, a large portion of the money that came to the American colonies actually came to the American southern colonies, because tobacco was a big money maker around the world. Indigo, where people could actually dye their clothing different colors from the plants. That was a big money maker. Rice fed a lot of people, was also a big money maker. So the 13 English colonies, especially the southern colonies, were making off well economically, especially even compared to the mother country of England, not to mention the other parts of Europe. So in the southern colonies, that's the cash crops, because they get you cash: tobacco, rice, and indigo. And again, theoretically at least, on paper at least, legally at least, southern colonies were supposed to load this stuff onto British ships and sell those tobacco, rice, and indigo crops to Britain, and then Britain would sell them to other places in Europe and other parts of the world, and basically Britain would get most of the cash. But again, Americans sometimes did not quite follow the law at the time, and of course, sometimes Americans don't quite follow the law today. The idea of sort of circumventing authority, sort of going around authority to get to what you want, as long as you're making an economic profit and apparently you're not hurting anyone, it sort of starts very early in the American nationhood. Now, there was one person that sort of typified all these things that Americans were. That is, someone that was curious about sort of religion, someone that was eager to make money, someone that was sort of born somewhat poor and sort of was making his way through life, someone who learned a skill on the job, that is an apprenticeship. So in reality, there's this one guy who sort of represented all of what the colonies were about, and eventually he came to represent, in many people's minds, in many colonial minds, the 13 English colonies here in America. His name was Ben Franklin, and of course there's just some of his achievements on the screen now. He was the 10th child of a candlestick maker. Now, certainly candlesticks were needed at the time because there were no electric lights, but being a candlestick maker didn't get you very much in Pennsylvania at the time. So he was born the 10th child, which is not unusual to have large families at the time. especially in the southern colonies, you had a large mortality rate, sometimes 50%. Oftentimes in the New England colonies and middle colonies, the mortality rate was less than that, maybe 20% or a little less than that. But nevertheless, Ben Franklin, being the 10th child, and because his family was very religious, Quakers, they decided to tithe him, that is, to give him to God. They wanted good old Ben to be a preacher. But Ben proved early on that he wasn't preacher material. When he went to school, he was very rebellious. He was one of those students that sometimes teachers have trouble controlling. Of course, Ben was always curious about many things, but unfortunately, he let his curiosity sort of at first run without any discipline, and that presented problems. So Ben decides, he read a book about how wonderful sea life was, how wonderful being a sailor was, and so Ben decides to run off when he's about your age, when he's about 13 years old or so. He decides to run off and join the merchant marine. He decides to get on a merchant ship that's going around the world because it's so awesome. The story that he read about the merchant ships is so awesome, and the school apparently was, not so great. If within about 7 months he returned from that trip and begged his parents to take him back. Apparently, you can't believe everything you read in books. Sometimes the authors sort of shade the truth. And apparently being in the merchant marine that time, being a sailor on a merchant ship, was not exactly a cushy, easy job. And Ben quickly found that out. He begged to go back to school, but his parents decided that maybe it might be best to give him an apprenticeship, that is, have him learn a skill that he might use for the rest of his life. Ben Franklin's older brother was sort of running a printing press at the time, and so the family apprenticed young Ben to his older brother. Wouldn't that be a dream come true for some of you young people, to be bossed around by your older sibling all the time for like 5 years? I'm sure that's a dream come true. Well, maybe for them. Probably for you, that'd be a nightmare. And Ben did not stay around for all 5 to 7 years of his apprenticeship. After several years, he learned enough, and he sort of ran off, found someone that would hire him. He started a printing business, and eventually, with the money he made, he was able to basically publish his own little almanac, his own little book. And today, almanacs have a lot of facts in them. Back then, farmers used almanacs basically to sort of guess what the weather was going to be. Ben Franklin's almanac sort of became famous because it has a lot of witty sayings, little humorous sayings, like a penny saved is a penny earned. He who never studies his ABCs will forever a blockhead be, and other fun little cute sayings like that. So he made so much money with his almanac, he could become a scientist. Now, I know today people pay you to become a scientist. Back then, you had to pay yourself to become a scientist. But of course, Ben's most known for his experiments in electricity, but he did many other things as well. He experimented with glasses and refraction as far as the lenses were concerned. He basically invented bifocals so people could read things that are close up. He, of course, he also invented a stove that burned hotter with less wood, which, of course, I'm sure a lot of young people liked because it was the young people's responsibility to generally go out and chop all the wood in the winter to bring back and put in the stove. And so, obviously, if your stove used less wood, that means you had less chores to do. But he also, of course, experimented with electricity. And of course, one of the things supposedly he was supposed to do was flying a kite when he was struck with electricity. But that's just a myth. He was flying a kite. He wasn't looking for lightning, but he was experimenting with the idea that clouds are electrically charged. That is, there's a difference, sort of a positive negative effects of altitude of water vapor in the clouds. And he was flying a kite at the time. And fortunately, lightning did not actually strike the kite. Otherwise, it would have come down and basically, killed Ben Franklin. But nevertheless, he was experimenting in many things. Of course, you can see he goes on and founds the first U.S. hospital. He basically starts what we now know as the post office. He's just did a lot of things in his life. And basically, he had been born somewhat poor, learned a skill that he used to make some money, and then used that money to do what he wanted to in life. Eventually, he becomes a diplomat, and he becomes a great leader during the American Revolutionary War. And again, sort of people, when people at the time thought about the American colonies, they thought about Ben Franklin. In fact, he was actually admitted to the Royal Society, which was basically a group of scientists at the time, world famous. And he was just an American colonist. At the time, the British sort of looked down on American colonies, thinking, these are sort of people that have left us and they're sort of rejects. And here was this man who had done so much in science. Now, colonies were growing, not just Ben Franklin who was there, but many others. And you can see, of course, in 1607, from that original 100 or so people that got off the ship at Jamestown, you can see the growth during the colonies. So by the time of the American Revolutionary War, there were about 2.5 million colonists in the American colonies. But not all colonies are created equal. Some were more populated than others. Certainly, Virginia was always the highest populated colony. It had started first. That's where they sent most of the convict labor and most of the child labor, and most of the indentured servants went to Virginia as well. They see Pennsylvania, Massachusetts, and Maryland all had high populations. And then there's little old Georgia at the bottom. And one of the reasons why in 1770 it was sort of at the last of the list, it had not been started, it had not been going for very long. It was the last colony established. And so they were just getting started. There weren't many people in Georgia at the time. And of course, remember, Delaware had basically been part of the Ben Franklin, Pennsylvania charter, but he had allowed those people from Sweden and Finland and Norway that were living there to break off and create their own little colony as well. So the 13 English colonies had certainly grown within a very short period of time to be impressive in their own rights. And we'll see how that growth eventually leads to problems with the mother country and eventually leads to the creation of the United States.